Thank you very much, Ali. Thank you, wonderful paper. We're going to take questions for all of the speakers at the end of the panel. So if you have got questions, can I invite you to post them in the chat, and we'll work through them at the end of the panel. Thanks very much, Ali. So I'm going to call now on Conall Cash from Cornell University, and we are going now to Madame Bovary. So the title of Conall's paper is Freedom as Self-Constitution in Literary Modernism on Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm glad to be here. I do have a slideshow, although I don't have a lot of slides, so let me try and get that up. Okay, so unfortunately, I will not be able to have it in the full play function because I have to read from the same screen, but hopefully everyone can at least see that.
Yeah, we can see the slides, yeah.
Okay, great. So this is kind of one of these papers that's sort of reduced down from a much longer text, and so there may be some aspects that are kind of move a little quickly without context. So I'm very happy to come back to anything that's that people would like more context for. Yeah, but that said, I'll just go ahead and read. So Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary is one of the last works of literature one could reasonably expect to be discussed under the sign of freedom or autonomy. As the philosopher Robert Pippin writes, the characters of Flaubert's novel but believe they are modern individuals, self-determining and free, and they are all, it turns out, wrong. Pippin's statement that Madame Bovary is the paradigmatic case of the modern novel wherein almost all desire is an imitation of desire, and thus where a character's purported freedom is revealed to be false, the cliched imitation of an external image of freedom and of personhood, expresses a widely held view of the novel and its importance to modernism. The approach I want to take in this paper is not to deny that Madame Bovary is a novel about failure, misunderstanding, selfishness, and mediocrity, or that one of its central concerns is to satirize the followers of Enlightenment ideals, including that of freedom. But what I want to argue, though, is that the kind of failure and the kind of misrecognition into which Flaubert's characters fall, and which his writing trains readers to notice and evaluate, is made possible only within a context in which freedom is a question that individuals are able to ask of themselves. The fact that Flaubert's characters can fail to be what they take themselves to be, the fact that a contradiction can be recognized by readers between how these characters live and the self-image that they project, all of this is possible only because these characters belong to a world in which the question of how to be a person and how to have an identity is not a simple or a given one, but is a question that can be posed explicitly. This world is a decidedly modern one, one in which identities are not fixed by birth or social position. One of the most influential recent readings of Flaubert's novel has emphasized just this disruption of identities as a liberating and democratizing element of Flaubert's art. This is the reading offered by Jacques Rancière, who places Flaubert as a central figure in what he calls the aesthetic regime of art. For Rancière, Flaubert's art contains a democratic core in its presentation of sensuous content as radically indeterminate and available. Instead of a literature of identities, which accords certain literary genres, certain ways of speaking, and certain forms of experience to certain types of people. The modern literature of which Flaubert is an exemplar is a literature of the sensuous, where any experience and any mode of representation is available to any person. Such a literature, for Rancière, is fundamentally disidentifying. It detaches the sensuous experiences that are rendered present by Flaubert's prose from possession by any individual. For Rancière, Flaubert shows this disidentification to be the ultimate lesson of literature and of the democratic age. The answer to Emma Bovary's tragic circumstances, which the author sees but the character does not, is to abandon the project of identity, the project of wanting to possess certain things and experiences as her own, and to instead surrender to the sheer indeterminacy of the sensuous present. And so this is really what I want to focus on, is this idea, and to sort of interrogate a bit this idea that the form of freedom offered by modern literature is one of abandoning identity or disidentification, which one finds in Rancière in particular, I think. And this is an idea I want to interrogate a bit. Rancière's work has played an important role in developing an approach to the art of the past 200 years in relation to the political questions of democracy and equality. But his conception of politics and his conception of what art can do are, in an important sense, I think, negative. And their negativity rests on a negative or deflationary account of subjectivity and identity. In his major political work, Disagreement, La Mésentente, Rancière distinguishes sharply between identities and subjects, which correspond in turn to the opposition between police and politics. Whereas the police order fixes identities by apportioning a proper name to everything and everyone, political subjectification, in Rancière's words, forces identities out of such obviousness. Any subjectification is a disidentification, Rancière writes, since it involves the assertion of a negative relationship to one's identity as given within the police order. The fundamental impasse that I want to identify in Rancière's work, which informs his reading of Flaubert as well as his theory of politics, concerns its essentially negative or ruptural conception of change, emancipation, and subjectivity. In his text on Madame Bovary and elsewhere, Rancière sees the abandonment of every project of the self through the happiness of surrendering to the sensuous present and the indifference of what he calls the equality of affects as the true response to the identificatory violence of the police order, or what he calls the distribution of the sensible. In this, the solution Rancière offers to the violence and inequality of every existing order or distribution of identities amounts to the interruption of identity as such. Yet this solution offers no conception of what would be instituted by this interruption, or who the subject of this transformation could possibly be. It rather conceives of this break from assigned identity as an abandonment of selfhood altogether. Even when using the terms subject and subjectification in positive distinction from identity, Rancière understands this subject in strictly negative terms, conceiving of subjectification as the destabilizing refusal of an assigned identity. There's no positive conception of how this subject's freedom to declare and define itself could be recognized by any society. Instead, politics and subjectivity are seen as the punctual disruption of a police order, which will always ultimately reassert itself. The limitations of this conception of politics, I argue, are likewise felt in Rancière's reading of Madame Bovary. Rancière is only able to account for the negative moment of identity, the moment of its failure. The lesson of Emma Bovary's suicide that Flaubert provides, according to Rancière, is the lesson that identity and a narrative of personal desire and ambition are what imprisons her, and that freedom, on the other hand, is to be found in the abandonment of self, the giving up of one's identity, so as to receive the pure presence of sensuous immediacy. It is Emma's failure to learn this lesson, her repeated inability to heed the call of the sensible world to give up her identity, that Flaubert punishes with her death at the end of the novel, according to Rancière. I want to argue instead that a more complex dynamic of selfhood is at stake in Flaubert's depiction of character. And in turn, through this, I want to suggest that this reading entails taking a different approach to literary modernism than that which Rancière, for one, proposes. The failure or error that Flaubert dramatizes, I argue, is not that of taking on an identity, but rather that of treating one's identity as a fixed state or image of self. Between these two alternatives of identity as something innate and fixed, or of identity as something false that must be replaced with a purely passive surrender to experience. Between these two alternatives is a conception of identity as a living activity. This notion of identity as a living activity, while having a broadly existentialist heritage, has been most clearly theorized by the contemporary philosopher Christine Korsgaard in terms of what she calls self-constitution. And this also refers back to a term that was used in an earlier paper. Korsgaard argues that the fundamental concern of moral action is that of establishing and maintaining one's own unity and coherence as a person. I do not act in a certain way because this action adheres to an external model of the good, but rather because this is the action that I can live with, the action that allows me to maintain my sense of my own coherence as a person. This is why for Korsgaard, in her words, being a person, having a personal identity, being a rational agent is in itself a form of work. Flaubert's characters misrecognize this condition of personhood, fleeing from temporal openness and uncertainty into the apparent comfort of an identity as a fixed image, as something guaranteed externally. But this desire itself, the desire to flee the temporal openness of one's identity, is only possible because one is haunted by such openness, because one knows it to be inescapable. Flaubert's characters' constant reminders to themselves that they are who they claim to be, Emma that she is a sophisticated and beloved woman, Homais that he is a learned man of science, or Rodolphe that he is a great lover, achieve ironic effect because their need to perform themselves only demonstrates that these identities do not naturally belong to them in the way that they imagine. So I guess very broadly, what I'm trying to suggest is the kind of ironic perspective upon the characters that we get in Flaubert, which is typically read as a kind of sign of a basically misanthropic perspective that the novel takes. I'm arguing that the unfreedom that the characters demonstrate actually is possible only on the basis of some implicit recognition of their own freedom, and that this is really this implicit freedom that makes it possible to sort of fail to be the person one takes oneself to be. That this is really what's opened up by the novel is a kind of implicit form of freedom that is only that the unfreedom that the novel demonstrates is only possible on the basis of that. This misrecognition on the part of the characters and the reflexive position that Flaubert solicits his readers to take up to the characters can be observed in the novel's most famous sequence, that of the Comice Agricole, the agricultural fair, which is the setting for the beginning of Emma's first adulterous affair with Rodolphe. The sequence is a model of modernist abstraction in that it distances its reader from individual dramas, training us to regard them from an external and ironic perspective, which shows them to be less all-encompassing than they are for the characters themselves. And Flaubert celebrated this passage as what he called a symphonic section of the novel because of the way it brings together elements into a unity. The central irony of the scene arises through the juxtaposition of the speeches at the agricultural fair and the romantic dialogue of Rodolphe and Emma, who have secluded themselves at some distance from the public to engage in their flirtation. As many commentators have noted, the scene works by juxtaposing the lofty romanticism of Rodolphe's words of seduction to the grandiose and hackneyed words of the government councillor speaking in praise of the village's agricultural diligence. And through this juxtaposition, the romantic speech itself is revealed to be just as stale and cliched as the government official's speech. But readers have not tended to explain exactly what is at stake in this juxtaposition in this scene. And as we'll see at certain points, Flaubert will literally just quote dialogue from the two different conversations, the two different scenes sort of together. So they become these elements in a kind of symphonic unity, which is clearly intended for some ironic effect. The councillor's speech extols the virtues of the people of this region of Normandy for their contribution to that great Enlightenment value, progress, the progress of the French nation and people. His speech culminates with the awarding of prizes to individuals for the contribution they have made with their labor to this progress. Flaubert leads us to see that the doctrine of progress treats life as a means rather than an end in itself, as the means to the end of ever more progress, which appears as an abstract value external to individuals. And Flaubert is deeply satirical and bitter towards this conception of progress. Individual lives are reduced to the status of a quantity of time and of labor contributed to the progress of the abstraction that is society or the nation. At the awarding of one prize to an elderly farm worker, Catherine Leroux, Flaubert's narration snarls, ainsi se tenait devant ces bourgeois épanouis ce demi-cercle de servitude. Thus, this half-century of servitude stood before these beaming bourgeois. The episode teaches us to read this celebration of progress as a horrific reduction of life to an indifferent quantity. The prize-giving ceremony is placed in ironic counterpoint to Emma and Rodolphe's intimate conversation, which offers the fantasy of an escape from that reduction to quantity with its opposite, a vision of the person as a pure quality. This is the romantic vision that Rodolphe solicits in Emma, who is nervous and excited at hearing these words of love directed at her uniquely. He speaks to her of souls that are destined to find each other amidst the dull, unfeeling masses, sparked by a shared sentiment, a glint of mutual recognition. I'm not going to actually discuss this passage, but it's there as an example. And the images are from the Claude Chaparral film of the novel. If these agricultural prizes provide an abstract, universally exchangeable measure of the value of a person, of their contribution to cultural progress, Rodolphe's words of love solicit Emma to respond to an appeal to her singularity, her unique destiny as one who is truly seen, not for her quantifiable contribution to an abstract universal, but for her qualitative singular essence, to see herself as an ideal, atemporal image saved from the homogeneous degradation of ordinary life. The irony Flaubert introduces with this counterpoint is thus not merely that Rodolphe's romantic speeches are no less hackneyed and rehearsed than the speeches of the government officials. It is that the ideal of personal recognition that he solicits Emma to feel is in fact itself deeply impersonal. Rodolphe's words of love, which the reader recognizes as manipulative and cliched, call on Emma to believe that she can be rescued from the impersonal quantification of a life bound to physicality and reproduction through a spiritual appeal to her qualitative essence. Yet this essence or spirit is shown to be just as impersonal and empty as the reduction of individuals to the quantity of labor they perform, because this idea of the self as a pure singularity, imperfect self-identity is contentless, and Rodolphe's words of love are words that could be said by anyone to anyone. Taking on the romantic fantasy of herself demands of Emma that she reject everything about herself that is material and contingent, everything that is tied to the world and how she is seen in everyday life by the ordinary people who do not access the lofty communion of souls that she supposedly shares with Rodolphe. The tragedy Flaubert points to in the juxtaposition of these scenes is that Emma believes she can escape an identity for others as a pure quantity by attaining a true identity for the true other, her lover, as a pure quality. Yet each of these conceptions of self has the same structure, for they treat identity as something fixed, guaranteed from outside oneself. The opposition the scene presents shows Emma to be hopelessly trapped between two forms of dependence, what we could indeed call two forms of heteronymous identity, becoming oneself, whether as pure quantity or pure quality, through accepting the law of another. A dynamic such as the one presented in this scene, I argue, cannot be understood according to the simple opposition between identity and its refusal, as in Rancière's reading of the novel. The failure of Flaubert's characters is not that they commit to an identity, but that they treat this identity as something that can save them from life, from their own openness to others and to the future. The novel shows that it is just as impossible to reject identity as it is for this identity to ever be complete or achieved. The fact that my particular ways of relating to the world around me are always revisable and never assured, the fact that nothing outside me ever confirms that the identity I have taken on is the right one, the one that correctly coheres the world for me. This is not something that we can or should overcome, for it is constitutive of all experience. I can neither exhaust the world through taking on an identity that perfectly holds it in place, nor dissolve myself into this world, since if I did, there would be no one there to have an experience. Emma could not kill herself if she were not burdened by the fact that she cannot not be herself. She cannot not have an interested and desiring outlook on the world, an outlook that is never assured of success, recognition, or fixity. The idea of an escape from this condition of experience without losing access to experience itself is incoherent. The only true loss of self of which Rancière speaks is death. To be clear, what is at stake here is not a mere psychological study of Flaubert's characters as though they were real people. Rather, the text perspective upon its characters and the form of freedom it holds out is staked on the difference between fiction and reality, between fictional characters and the real people who are the novel's readers. For it is the latter who are able to perceive the novel's ironic perspective, while the former, the characters, are trapped in the damaging forms of self-perception that their context allows them. Flaubert's readers, in short, if they bring the form of attention to the novel that its ironic perspective cultivates, are capable of a reflexivity that is unavailable to his characters. And this would be the place of freedom in the novel. It is this reflexivity that is at stake in the idea of self-constitution as a form of freedom. A subject of self-constitution cannot just voluntaristically make themselves into whatever they choose, but they are capable of reflecting upon themselves, their own past, their own behavior, and of acting differently in light of this reflection. So to conclude, this then is the broader argument about modernism and freedom that I mean to sketch here briefly through this reading of Madame Bovary. If one of the signal qualities of modernism is to disrupt the conventionalized ways that the perceptible world is ordered, this disruption, this making it new, should not be understood in terms of the dissolution of a subjective experience or of the identity that one brings to this experience. An identity in this sense is constitutive of experience, is a large part of what I'm trying to demonstrate. Rather, modernist works render palpable the tension, openness, and risk intrinsic to every identity, the condition of identity as both incompletable and inescapable. Modernist works enable an engagement of the question of freedom as self-constitution in their readers by making available a self-reflexive relationship towards identity as that which can only be practiced in openness towards the world, to others, to time, on pain of death. Emma Bovary dies so that a reader able to cope with the uncertainty and freedom of selfhood as an activity can live. And I'll end it there, thank you.